for joining us live on YouTube. We are War Cry Podcast. We have our live streaming today from the Yakima Nation and Yakima Valley. This is season 2, episode 5. We have a guest today, and our intent is to learn about missing and murdered Indigenous women and people in the Yakima Valley and Yakimas impacted by violence in urban areas. And we are joined today by a guest that has written numerous articles on this topic. This topic can be very sensitive and triggering, so we just urge you to take care either before, during, or after this live streaming is happening. So again, welcome to this episode of War Cry Podcast. We are an all-native run podcast discussing data, events, stories, issues, and historical connections about Northwest missing and murdered natives. We are located on the Yakama Reservation in Eastern Washington State. And we thank you for joining us for this episode. We are live streaming during the noon hour Pacific time. My name is Emily Washings, and co-hosts today are Patsy Whitefoot, Robin Peebishy, and Lucy Smartlout. Our guest today is Tammy Ayer with the Yakima Herald Republic, which is a local newspaper. And for announcements, we want to acknowledge that we have wildfires taking place right now in the Yakima Valley. Everybody that is in the Yakima Valley and anybody that has allergies is aware of this. And these are a couple of photos of just the haze that's happening. And to everybody that's fighting the fires or having to evacuate, our thoughts are with you at this time. I want to, before I have our guests introduce themselves, I want to just read a quote from our previous session. You know, we had been on the Operation Lady Justice Northwest listening session last June 2020, and we put a podcast about that. And for one of my questions that I asked, I asked, we have one woman from the Yakima Valley that was found in the 1980s, and she hasn't had DNA taken. That technology did not exist at the time. In order to take the DNA now, it'll cost at least $5,000 to exhume her. The Yakima County Sheriff has considered this a priority. However, they have listed cost as a barrier to collect the DNA. Is there a federal process or mechanism to support this process? It will mean justice. Again, this Operation Lady Justice listening session was with the White House, a different presidential administration at that time, and the FBI and Department of Justice. And so this is kind of the topic that we're going to be covering today with our guest, Tammy Ayer, and I'll turn it over to her to introduce herself.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you all, ladies, for inviting me to participate today. I'm honored to be here and to talk more about this issue. I've been at the Yakima Herald Republic for a little over 6 years now, and I've reported on this issue for around 3, I think, and it really started, Emily, you were one of the first people that I talked to about this issue, and I have to say, not being from this area, I'm originally from Indiana, when you kind of filled me in on just getting started, I was staggered at this, at the numbers of missing women, missing Native women, the violence. And so it's gone on from there. And really, my coverage at first began with legislative issues that Gina Mossberger had brought forth to try to get a better idea of the data and the numbers of missing Indigenous women we have in Washington State. And from then on, it kind of began with that level, but really my main focus these days, and I kind of felt this way from the beginning, is to tell these women's and these men's stories. I think it's important that their names and their stories be kept out there. They're not just seen as numbers, statistics. People need to know who they were and who they are, and the entire community needs to be concerned about this issue.
Thank you very much, Tammy. I'm going to turn it over to Robin to ask her first question. Take it away.
Hi, Tammy. It's really great to see you. So you did kind of go into a bit about starting and speaking about MMIW and MMIP. Can you just elaborate a bit more, like why that was important to you? And I think I had heard you mention before that you just recognize a deficit of those types of stories and bringing those stories out here in Yakima Valley. Could you speak a bit to that in your experience?
Sure, thank you. So I come from a history background. As a reporter, I've been a reporter, professional reporter since 1989, but I also have a master's degree in history. And when I was working on my degree, and as a reporter, I think it's important for all stories to be told. It's frustrating to me, and I came across this over and over again in my research when I was, earning my master's, that you'd go back into old newspapers and it's only certain stories were being told. And I hate that. As a reporter now, looking back on that, that's very frustrating. But for a complete history, and history is never going to be complete because there's so many stories. Everyone has a story. But we as journalists and we as historians need to tell those stories as completely as possible. And frankly, yeah, when I first started reporting on this issue, again, I had no idea. I had heard about the cases of missing Indigenous women and missing and murdered Indigenous women down on the border with Mexico. And then I heard more about the issue in Canada and the Highway of Tears, but frankly, I didn't know the scope of it in the United States. And when I got here, and again, when I started talking to Emily about this issue, and I found it very frustrating that fairly often, and I can't say this was always the case, but fairly often, stories would just be really short. There's a brief that a woman was found. A woman was found here. A woman's body was found here. And that was it. There was no information about who she was. Who was she? Who were her family? Would they miss her? I just was frustrated with that. And that really drove my focus again toward the families, toward telling these women's stories and men's completely, because not only is it important now, but it's important for the future. So.
Yeah, follow up, Robin? Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up when we first talked, Tammy. I remember that moment clear as day. I was on a trip actually, and I got a message. And I really remember, I'm a very visual person, but I remember laying there thinking, why is this reporter asking about MMIW? And then I remember this really, this fan that had really sharp blades that was above me. And I don't know, something about it, it just, it really made the moment seem really sharp and real, because these kind of issues bring up so much. And, a lot of us were taught, these are some things that we whisper. This is a silent epidemic. This is a silent crisis that people aren't attentive to. And I remember, as I always do, I always reference our Yakima Nation Tribal Council and our, we didn't have an MMIW committee at that time. And then I had thought, after I sent that initial message, will these women and their families think they're alone if there's not any Yakima that's going to comment on record? And so I went back to you and I said, if you don't get a response, I will be on record with this. And so I appreciate you bringing that up and kind of even illuminating that for our audience a little bit, the process of speaking up for our women. It can take a lot, and on both sides of it. I want to bring us to the case that we're talking about right now, with the woman that's unidentified. Even though there's DNA technology that exists to help identify her, she remains unidentified. The DNA technology did not exist at that level at that time. And we're going to bring up the article that you wrote on December 15th, 2018. Lower Valley human remains discovered in 1988 to be exhumed for DNA. And I wonder if you can just share with us about, who she is, from what we know about her so far, and yeah, so who is she and what do we know about her so far?
Sure. Well, and I use the reference of Parker Doe because she was found near the unincorporated town of Parker. She was very close to the Yakima River. She was found by a horseback rider. And the interesting thing is she was very close to the road. It's a dirt road that goes off of Parker Bridge Road, and it runs parallel to the river. And people had used that. It's a dirt road, as you could see, and people had used it for various. People would go back there and go fishing and such. But if you're in a car, you didn't have the viewpoint of the person on horseback. So this rancher was out for a horseback ride, and he could see her lying down in that area, and it's very much overgrown now. As you see here, it's quite thick with these trees. This is a narrow leaf willow tree. There's some chokecherry. But where the county coroner, Yakima County Coroner Jim Curtis, is standing with his cadaver dog, Justice, you can't really tell too much from the photo, but there's a very slight rise. And the way she was, her head would have been closest to him, and the road would be to your left, and her feet were closest to the road. Horseback rider saw her. She still had her clothing. He called, and multiple police agencies came, as usual. This is tribal land here. FBI, BIA, tribal police, Yakima County Sheriff's Office. And they came, and then the next day, authorities with the Green River Task Force also came. And that wasn't because they suspected the then unknown killer was responsible for this, but they had so much expertise in collecting information from older crime scenes. They believe, they estimated that she had been there for possibly 4 to 10 months. So her skull was removed. As you saw in some of those photos, it was removed. It was taken to Central Washington University for a reconstruction, a clay model of her head. That was the first time the sheriff's office had ever done anything like that. Unfortunately, even the people who put it together were not hopeful that it would help. And it only resulted in a few tips that didn't really go anywhere. It's just not very good, even though it was considered new technology at the time. What they're hoping to do today is get a digital reconstruction of her skull and her face. That's going to be much more accurate. Even if they did a clay model today, it would be much better than this one. But at the same time, they don't even need to do that anymore. They can do a digital reconstruction. It'll be surprisingly accurate. One in particular, there's one that they do in color, Parabon Technologies, I believe it's called, and they've done it with people who are living now, and it's really, they take the DNA and then they do the digital reconstruction. We're getting closer to exhuming her. The funding is in place. The coroner at this point is just waiting to hear back from West Hills Memorial Park, which is where she's believed to have been buried. Her skull was at Central Washington until very recently. It's actually at the King County Medical Examiner's Office now, and when she is exhumed, officials with the King County Medical Examiner's Office will be here for that. The coroner has also asked that tribal officials come. There'll probably be FBI, other officials. So, and he wants to do it as soon as possible. If he can make arrangements, it's a lot of coordinating. It's a lot of agencies to get together. But if he could, he would do it tomorrow. I mean, he said at this point, everything's in place. It's just a matter of hearing back from West Hills and setting that date and then getting everyone there. And at that point, everyone's confident. He's fairly confident. The sheriff's office investigators are confident she can be identified. As you mentioned, that technology has just, DNA technology has changed drastically. It wasn't even a thing then, really. Confident she'll be identified.
Thank you so much for that. From my quick calculations, we're at 33 years of having her unidentified.
Yep.
And I just want to give a note, you know, since she was found on the Yakama Reservation, and we do have families that have missing loved ones, that, you know, if this is your loved one or we come to find out, our hearts are with you. I think this is a very difficult topic to discuss and talk about it. And I appreciate the amount of information, because we need to know these kind of processes unfortunately, for the amount that we have here. I'll turn it over to Lucy for her question or insight.
Thank you for the information, Tammy. It floors me to think about 33 years of not knowing, 33 years of having family members who just don't know what happened, or even to know that somebody, could have possibly been looking for her. And I don't know, that it just really kind of resonates somewhere different with me right now. When we're talking about it and we're actually, looking at the pictures, and then you're providing the explanation behind it. So I just want to ask, like, what prompted the exclamation, and what would, like, let's say hypothetically, some families wanted to do something similar, like what would those processes be from your knowledge?
Well, it's interesting. The current Yakima County Coroner, Jim Curtis, he's been in office for a few years now, and he has really been the one who has pushed this issue. And he feels very strongly, he feels very strongly she needs to be identified and she needs to be returned to her family for a proper burial. And he has really been the one who has pushed this. The sheriff's office has had the case the whole time. That's another issue as to how they came to have the case. But I spoke with the investigator. There's a new investigator on the case. I mean, he's not new to the sheriff's office, but he's new to his position, which is head of detectives. His name's Jason Pepper. The previous person that I spoke with there was, he retired in late January. Yeah. But the whole process of exhumation, it's much more complicated, I guess. I think sometimes people think it would be. First of all, it's quite expensive, and I don't know if private citizens can have this done. I do believe they can, and this is something that you hear a lot about on TV shows and movies and this sort of thing. But frankly, it doesn't really happen that often. I was involved with the story back in Indiana where several exhumations took place, but I did not actually cover it myself. I was not there. I was not present at the time. And that was an Indiana State Police investigation. But I think what the message that I would like to get across in this, and realizing and understanding that she could have family members here, I try to be as respectful as possible in my reporting on this issue. It gets a little, I understand it can be extremely triggering at times, talking about what's happened to her in the 33 years since she was found. And I think at times she's been treated very disrespectfully. And so I try to be mindful of that in my coverage. But what's really going to be important here is when we get her exhumed is that DNA. Family members, if they have a missing loved one, they can provide their DNA. They can give a DNA sample at their local law enforcement agency, and that will be entered into a database. We are hoping that when her DNA is taken, there is somewhere and there can be a match. But I guess since I've never covered something like this before, I'm trying to be as respectful as possible, but also as explanatory as possible in the right way. So.
You have a follow-up, Lucy?
I do, just really quickly. When you were first doing your introduction, you had mentioned that the community should be concerned. And I just wanted to get a little bit more insight as to why does our community need to know about this? Why should we all be concerned?
Well, and I try to stress that as much as possible in my coverage because we are a community. This entire area, we're on Yakima ancestral lands. First of all, that should be acknowledged. That should always be acknowledged. And we are all part of this community. I have to say, having previously lived in places that are very flat, without mountains, without ridges, this literal ridge between the upper and lower valleys, that was another thing that kind of surprised me, that there can be people who have lived here their entire lives and they don't know exactly what's happening on the other side of that ridge. And a naturally curious person, which is good for my work, but I'm always asking questions. I'm always learning. I think that's important. So the repercussions, what kind of came to me was I was reading through some old stories. These were stories that were written in the early 90s when around the time when one woman was found. And there were some meetings. Inslee came to town. I think at that point he was a congressman. People were saying something needs to happen here. Jurisdictional issues, other issues, cases not being taken seriously. And a reporter, I can't remember who it was, mentioned in one of his stories, and it was actually near the end of the story. I think it was the last paragraph. It should have been a story in itself. He added up I think he mentioned 12 or 13 women, the 12 or 13, and he said that I think almost all of them were mothers, and among those women, they left behind, I want to say it was at least 24 children. These are children who, and they were of varying ages, grew up, and maybe they were so young. I know of one woman who was 6 years old when her mother was murdered, and she barely remembers her mom. She just really doesn't remember her. To teenagers. And I thought of that. You're a child, you're growing up, or you're a teenager and you have to deal with that severe loss. How's that going to affect your life's path? Everybody should be concerned about this because those are children, those are people in the community, and that can ripple out and have long-lasting effects. It can change their lives, and it can have greater impacts in the communities. Everyone should be aware. And safety, everyone should be aware that I think people are encouraged to stay safe and make sensible decisions, but at the same time, areas that are much less safe, people should not have to grow up in fear. So.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Patsy for her question or insight. And Patsy, you're on mute.
Good morning, and thank you, Tammy, for being with us today. And just naturally, I have a number of questions but also thoughts on just what you're sharing, and we could perhaps talk about it at another time. But it sounds like from what you've shared with us that the role of the children of these missing family members is significant. I'm curious what you see in the valley here, both Upper and Yakima, in terms of partnerships to address violence in our community. What is being done with these partner agencies that exist? To your knowledge, what are you aware of that's going on to address violence? I mean, we have similar situations going on all around the valley.
Thank you, Patsy. Yeah, and that's a great question. And the first thing that popped into my head was something that I reported on before the pandemic, which is kind of the way the world is now, isn't it? Pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, but we're still in it. So I met a man, his name's Chevy Cortez, and he was a former gang member who just, he got out, and then after he made it beyond some of his choices in life. He's very successful, but he wanted to give back. And what he's doing is he was getting young men, boys and young men together for weekend basketball games. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but at the same time, he was actually actively asking gang members, younger gang members or potential gang members to get together and just play basketball. And that's stuck in that kind of popped into my head because you hear a lot about organizations, Project Safe, you hear about all these different organizations. Sometimes it gets very bureaucratic. And what's the real ground level work that's happening? How are you helping address this? How are you making others see that we're all people, we're all here together? And his efforts with that, I thought were amazing. And he would have a few dozen kids there. And he wasn't the only one. There were other adults who were supervising, and it was at a public school area in a gym. But that was the first thing that I thought about. I know that other organizations like the White Swan Community Coalition have been supportive of the skate park and other public areas where young people can get together. But frankly, it's those kind of responses, Patsy, that just popped into my head. I tend to my eyes tend to kind of glaze over when organizations form sometimes because, again, I'm skeptical of the real hands-on work. But and I could think of other things. I know there are arts groups too that try to get people together, but I do think there needs to be much more interaction again between the upper and lower valleys. And I need to check with Chevy to see if he's still doing that.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So in your description that you're talking about, it could be very bureaucratic, but it sounds like with the work that's going on with this particular case that the agencies appear to be trying to come together. And I'm wondering what are some of the learnings that can occur from this, which is very unusual, as you said, but everyone, it sounds like, is going through this process of attempting to work together.
Yeah, now I'm really wondering. I need to check with him to find out how he's doing. But I just, being a reporter since 1989, and I've seen, again, organizations come and go. People talk a lot. Politicians can talk a lot. People can start groups. But frankly, I think what people need to learn is you need to bring together the people that you're trying to help. It just seems odd to me that some of these groups are a lot of people talking around a table, and they're leaders in the community, and it's important that they get together, but it needs to be more than just meetings. I do also think that maybe some of these events could be bigger public events where information can be provided. I remember I was down at Granger at the radio station for something. It's been a few months ago, and I was surprised there were all these tents, and there was it was like a community market, but it was something they do on a regular basis there at the radio station, and I'd heard nothing about it. And I almost wish that that could be a thing, not just tied to a community market, but maybe its own little get together. I'm not an expert on this by far, but it seems to me the real success, the breakthroughs happen when the people who are supposed to be impacted by all these meetings and leadership actually get together and get to know each other, I guess. Again, as community members, we're all here, so.
Well, thank you. Further conversations about this as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Patsy.
Yeah, I want to pivot back real quickly to the article and something that was brought up, and I'm going to ask that Robin actually bring this question up. Go ahead, Robin, you're on mute.
Hi, thanks. So, of course, reading the article, there were talks, and I'll just be honest, as a community member, this is something that always circulates, and I know people are afraid to bring it up. It's just that there's either a theory or things point to possible serial killers or serial killer between like the 1980s that could be either operating on the reservation, near the reservation, or through the reservation, and the fact that where Parker Doe was found, there were other women found there as well, who had been murdered. And side thing here is also mentioned is how the Golden State Killer was found and through DNA tests. So despite all of these years since the 80s, since he had been operating, finding him and his identity out had to be through DNA testing. But I also want to speak to a little bit how reluctant Native people are in terms of just giving out their DNA in general. There's also been studies about how Native people also don't like to donate organs. A lot of it is religious based, cultural based. as well as just, I mean, just speaking as a Native person, it's like Native bodies have been so violated over the years. It's like, we don't want to do that anymore. But I don't know if you could either speak to the article you had written about Parker Doe and possible like serial killer and maybe a location or things like that, or even about DNA and things like that.
You're on mute, Tammy.
Thank you. Okay. Robin, thank you for bringing up the DNA because that's interesting. I have friends who've done the ancestry, the 23andMe thing, and the ancestry efforts through DNA. And I haven't gotten to that point yet because I'm reluctant. Reading that book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, it kind of makes you wonder what happens to your DNA after you provide it, even though you provided it willingly and she didn't. And I'm not sure, that might be something that I need to address better in future stories because DNA is really crucial. And I can understand the reluctance, again, coming from my own reluctance. When I went to one of the State Patrol's labs, oh gosh, it's been a couple years ago, I had to provide a DNA swab and I thought that was kind of weird. And they're like, we ask everybody to do it. And I said, okay. But your question about serial killers is a persistent question, even though the FBI has said back in the mid 2000s, they said that there was no evidence of a serial killer. We do know that there was a serial killer operating. His name is John Bill Fletcher Jr. Now, he's the one who was responsible for the ladies who were found near Parker Doe's location. And he had a very predictable MO, method of operation. That was his area. He got ladies, they would come with him willingly, but he always went to that same area. And then he tried, he murdered 2 women. He tried to murder 2 other women that we know of. And an investigator, a retired investigator with the sheriff's office, believes that he may have been responsible for other murders when he made his way from Texas, where he had been paroled in 1986, to Yakima. And he came here because he had connections, family connections, I believe. And that investigator, Rod Shaw, has said that he thinks Mr. Fletcher might have been. He's a suspect in Parker Doe's case, let's say. But there are, and Emily and I have talked about this before, there are several other cases that have striking similarities. And several women were strangled. And they were discovered in remote locations. We have heard at different times that, and different law enforcement has said this, that they thought an older man was preying on vulnerable women in the lower valley. He would be in places where they might be. I've heard different things about ladies' pool tournaments at different taverns and such, and that he would know that he could go there and prey on, there would be women who were vulnerable. So again, that's still, the FBI did say when they released the results of a big investigation they had back in the early 2008, I believe. It was a 2-year investigation. They said that they had developed potential suspects in, I believe, 3 of the cases. But for lack of evidence, they did not follow through on making an arrest. We do know that sometimes people have been found in remote locations and there's not sufficient evidence to meet federal prosecution standards, I guess, or police standards. But I'm no investigator, but hearing the similarities in some of these cases really makes you wonder. So.
When you're talking about cases, I want to acknowledge that the Yakima Herald Republic is one of the only local newspapers that I'm aware of that actually publishes and updates an ongoing list of missing tribal members, missing women, as well as cases, unsolved cases, homicide cases, and cases in progress and solved cases. And I wonder if we can have you go through this vanish list, and then I'll check in with my co-host to see if they have any other insights after you. And if we have anybody from our live audience that has any questions or insights as well.
Sure. So, and Emily, when we've talked about this issue, it's always been a kind of, I want to respect the privacy of families. Not every family, as we've all talked about, not every family wants to share the information about their loved one. They're maybe not ready to talk about it, or maybe they don't ever want to talk about it. And I always respect that. I really, it comes down to whether, they want to speak or not. I just feel it's important to get these ladies' stories and their information out here and make others aware of who they were and why this is. When you start to go through this list, you realize this is unfortunately a long list. And so when I started on this issue again, Emily, after we had started talking about it, after you had started telling me more about it, I started pulling some records from archives, and that's how I started building this list. And I didn't really think much about it. I thought, well, if I'm going to be reporting on this issue, we should know who some of these ladies were. And so I started building it that way. And then I have, so we thought it was important to delineate, some women are missing, some have, they have been determined as homicides. Sometimes that changes. We know that there have been cases where at first it was undetermined and then later they said a possible homicide or probable homicide, that sort of thing. So that can change. That's not set in stone either. But I thought it was important to include the mysterious deaths as well, because these are families dealing with loss and their deaths are suspicious. There's something there are unanswered questions. It's not clear. And you can certainly, it can be more challenging with older cases. Again, with the lack of evidence and depending on what investigators find. But I also thought it was important to include, and this list is nowhere, we know it's not complete, and we'll never say that it is because we know it's not. There are cases I know of that people haven't spoken of and they would not prefer to have them on there. But I thought it was important to put the court cases in there as well, because those are happening. COVID has severely delayed, as expected, some of the progress of some of these cases. But we're hopeful those will eventually make their way to the court system and justice will be served. And then I thought it was important to note that there are also closed cases. I do have a couple that I need to add to the list, and I will do that at some point. But I just hope this list, I don't mean it to be triggering, and I know it can be and probably has been, but I think it's important again to see, for the community to see this list. This is a long list. This is a lot of women. This is a lot of ladies and girls who the families don't have answers and there's no justice, and they need to know that that's happening. And for me, again, seeing the list grow has just been, that's just another way that I can stress how important this is, I guess. So.
It is a long list. I want to turn it to my co-hosts for additional insight or questions.
I don't have a question, just a comment, Tammy, and of course my sister's on this list, Daisy Mae Heath. And I think just each one of these cases have its own unique variables about it. You know, you were talking about the role of the FBI and the role of the various law enforcement agencies. Our experience has not been a positive experience with law enforcement. And so I'm just curious, at what level are each of these cases at, and what kind of communication has gone on with families? I mean, that's, I know, very challenging because it's a case by case issue, but it's one I think that deserves respect. As you said earlier, it just feels like in, some of the cases that the respect hasn't been shown. Just some examples are, I did give DNA in support of my sister, and did not get a response back, from law enforcement. And I didn't do it once, I did it twice, and there wasn't a response. And there's just an issue with communication, one that I've addressed, not only with other agencies, but also, with federal officials as well, because of the lack of communication that goes on. And I think that's the major frustration, is just the lack of communication that occurs. And so I think, what we're attempting to do here with War Cry is to be able to communicate some of this information that hasn't been available for families. And I recognize it is triggering because we are all at different places. Even in our families, we're all at different places in terms of, our own personal reconciliation, if any, in our lifetime. But I just want to say, I think it's important to talk about as well. And I think with regard to just, working with families, just with my own with my own adult children and adult nephews and nieces who were children when my sister went missing. I know it's a real challenge, and it's difficult to be able to talk about these kind of issues. But for families, I think it's important that we continue communicating with one another, just as the law enforcement agencies are, talking with one another. But as you're going through that process with Parker Doe, I think it's important that that communication process be shared with us as well as families. I think that is so key, to be shared with the community. And I think that's simply what we're trying to do, is, be open-minded in sharing this information with one another, because for too long, this silence has been, hasn't helped us. I was going to ask a question, but I went off. Sorry.
Okay.
We can come back. Lucy?
You had mentioned John Bill Fletcher Jr. So what happened to him?
He is currently at the Monroe Correctional Center, and his earliest possible release date is September of 2032. It's interesting when we talk about that he was convicted for two of the cases of the ladies who were found near where Doe was found. His conviction didn't come until, I want to say, the early 2000s. And I brought some notes with me, but I'm not going to, kind of a pile here. What had happened was those ladies had been found, but their killer remained unknown for some time. He actually went to prison in early 1989 for rape and attempted murder, I believe. I would need to double check those charges for one of the ladies that he took there and tried to kill. So he was in the correctional system. He had provided DNA, and they later, as part of, I believe, the FBI investigation in the mid-2000s, compared his DNA, and they convicted, well, he pled guilty. They convicted him because his DNA matched DNA that was taken from those scenes. But so that was added on to his sentence that he already had. I had someone ask me, they thought that he had a life sentence, and I never saw that anywhere. But I was surprised to see that basically 10 years he could be out. And if I recall correctly, he's in his mid-60s. So, I mean, he is an old man, but that's where he is right now, Monroe. Yep. And he won't talk to anybody. I haven't personally tried to talk to him, but law enforcement has tried to talk to him over and over and over again through the years about Parker Doe, and he won't talk to anybody about it. So, yeah.
Thank you for that insight. Patsy, did you remember your question?
Oh, no, I was looking at my notes what was my question? I'll come back to it. Thank you.
Okay. I want to thank each of our 5 people that are watching. Our producer has let us know, and thank you very much for joining us on this live stream. Again, we're talking to Tammy Ayer about her coverage of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the Yakima Valley and Yakimas in urban areas, with particular emphasis on the unidentified woman in the Parker area, also referred to as Parker Doe. Okay, I just want to open it up to see if any of the, you got it?
Yes, so Tammy, I wanted to ask you about your background in history. You said you got your, your bachelor's and your master's in history. I'm curious why you were going through that process, how you got steered in this direction, what steered you toward the work that you're doing today, particularly in history, because, when I think about history and how it's taught in our mainstream institutions, it's not going to address Native history or Indigenous history at all. So I'm curious how you got steered this way.
Well, so Patsy, I've always been interested in history. I've always been a bit of a historian, and I at one point thought that I wanted to go on and get my PhD and be a professor. So that's kind of how I got started in college. And but I've always been interested in women's history, and I'm of the Howard Zinn School of History. He wrote A People's History of the United States, and I met him, and I was just really inspired again to tell the stories of real people. It gets very tiresome to read over and over the same names and the same people. I'm not interested necessarily in military history or political history, that sort of thing. I want to hear the history of real people. Like, what was it? I'm always the one asking the question, what was it like to live like then at that time? And then when I came here, I've always I consider myself a historian. I'm a journalist and a historian, but I'm reporting history for now, for the future. And it's important for us as journalists to be as accurate as possible, but also to tell as many stories, to tell the story of the community as completely as possible. And to be honest, my coverage of missing and murdered Indigenous women basically started with a story assignment. The editor came up to me and he had a press release from Gina Mossbrucker that said that was when she was proposing her legislation for the Washington State Patrol's data report that came out more than a year after that. And of course, that's been discussed at length, but again, he asked me to write this press release, and that's when I started reaching out to people, Emily and others, and started learning and hearing some of these stories. And frankly, I was just shocked. Again, I was just, and then so that at that point, that kind of, here's a topic that needs to be more completely reported. And at the same time, I'm interested in the women's lives, who's, all women. Again, it needs to be complete. It doesn't, history needs to be everybody. So that kind of launched me, the nexus of those two things really got me interested in this topic, that it needed to be reported more completely. It needed to be told as completely as possible. And then I won't ever forget that first State Patrol meeting that they had back in October, was that 2018, I believe. So many people came to that they had to expand the room. There were people standing outside, and to hear those stories, that just really, at that point, I was just super focused. I said, I'm going to focus on this as long as I can, because it needs to be, these stories need to be told. And I have seen over the past couple of years, more people have come forward. But yeah, you're pulling up this original story and that historical background there. It's not just the last 50 years. It's not just the last 60 years. This has been going on for centuries. And that needs to be told too. We also do need to report on older. I personally know of an older case. I haven't gotten it documented yet. It might have been in the 1940s or 50s, where a man was suspected of killing his wife and daughter, and they were Indigenous. So there's so many more threads out there. And I told people I could write about this topic full time. I can't do that because we're trying to cover the community as completely as possible. COVID has affected that, all kinds of things. And I do write about other issues, but I try to write about this as much as I can, because there are many more stories to tell.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I was just curious where that spark came from, and appreciate it though. And thank you for being, doing this important work and doing it in a respectful way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to add on to that the I mean, what this was essentially doing was a validation of our oral and our historical accounts of the Yakima War. And the reason why the Yakima War started was about violence against Yakima women. And we have all these different history books that are written, and very few reference that. And so to have an article that reaffirms that, stretching back over 165 years, this is real. I mean, the title of that article, I mean, it just blew everybody away. I mean, I'm at a powwow in a different place. This is before everything shut down, and people are referencing your articles and in reference to the violence that's taking place and the awareness that's building. I think of the families that don't have to reiterate and keep saying, keep talking about, you know, the dates and the specifics that has happened to their families, because they have a news organization that has verified that and validated that. And unfortunately, in this community and in this system, that's questioned sometimes.
Yeah.
And because there's a primary source information, you know, we see students writing about this more, able to do presentations from, you know, K-12 through college. And you know, it really is a pivot point in how we do reporting in the Yakima Valley about these cases, I feel like.
Well, and I have to say, I'm really proud to be part of that. I'm glad that I've been part of that correction and that greater awareness. Yeah.
Okay, does anybody else have any other comments?
Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead, Robin.
Oh, okay. Just comments. And again, I want to echo what Patsy said. Thank you so much for doing this work. And I really appreciate you recognizing like the void of Indigenous voices and bringing them to light. We do always need those allies to recognize that, so that we can have that ability to break through those ceilings. And again, like Emily said, to validate all of the stories that we have been telling and that we know through our own history and oral history, and kind of bringing that to light as well. And then again, just final comment is, again, thank you as well for taking those precautions and reporting respectfully, because I know that's something that isn't always done. We can understand that as well as a group, how we want to be extremely respectful to families. And so sometimes for us, that even means not showing those stories, because, you know, people are in their different, like in their different spaces and where they are with either grief or with dealing with what had happened. And so we really appreciate that, at least for myself, in this outlet with you, is the fear that this is going to be blown out or misrepresented isn't present, you know, here, because that's something that always is like, oh, they're going to misconstrue everything that's being saying. And that's a part of one of the enemy, and what kind of lets these cases go on as well. It's just the misreporting and misrepresentation and misinformation that goes on through the press. And it's just, I didn't know you had a history background, and that's really awesome. So we're all a bunch of history nerds and buffs here. Yeah, but thank you, Tammy, so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
And I just wanted to add, I didn't touch on this particular question, but the individuals that are listed are predominantly women in my work that I've been doing with education and the identification of particularly students, but this impacts all Native people. It's just the identification of our people and the underrepresentation or the misclassification of our people is also a major issue too. And so I find in working with schools that it's important for us to help support our young people so that they know how they identify as a Native person. And I just wanted to share that while we might be on the Yakama Reservation in our traditional territories, that doesn't mean we don't have other tribal people that are living here as well. And they also have family members wherever they come from who may be missing and or murdered as well. And several of us come from diverse backgrounds too. And so there's this diversity that we each bring to this discussion, and interrelationships, intertribal relationships that we have. I always share that the family descendancy that I have with my children and my grandchildren and great grandchildren covers pretty much the entire Western states, plus Canada and Native Hawaiian. And so I've got grandchildren and great grandchildren that extend their lineage that far. And so if I'm just one person, what about the other people that are living here on the Yakima Indian Reservation in our traditional territories? So Tammy, there's more work for you to do.
Quite a bit, yeah. Yes. Thank you, Patsy. Yep.
One more, I have a comment, just some insight. So first, Tammy, I know this may be another conversation, but I would love to hear about some of the adversity that you've experienced while reporting this information, particularly in the Yakima Valley. Again, that could be another conversation. And like Patsy had tasked you, I'm going to also task you and us, another piece of really expanding our list to our missing and murdered Indigenous men, and also to our, Two-Spirit and LGBTQ community, because at times I feel, we're totally underrepresented, and now we kind of have this platform and it's like, oh, we have traction. And so, I think we would all be willing to work on that in some way, shape, or form, to really start seeking out some things. And lastly, what we like to ask, or what we like to try to ask, is when we remember, is what do you do for self-care during such heavy topics such as this?
Oh, yeah. I run. I'm a runner. So that's for me, my kind of, it's been really important during COVID, but yeah, I find myself, I'll go out and I might be out for hours and I'll just be kind of going through things or talking myself through things. That's really how I do it. But, and if I'm not running and I have a little time, I do like to read nonfiction, more history. That's what I do for fun too. So, yeah, but for me, being physical and being out there and running has really been helpful. Yeah, that's what I do.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I haven't worked up to running yet. I'm still walking. I don't know about anybody else. If we have any other runners here. No? Okay.
I used to.
Oh, Kathy used to. Okay. And again, Yakima Herald Republic is one of the only local newspapers in the country to publish missing and murdered Indigenous women names of the missing and the ongoing cases. Tammy Ayer is the reporter there. You can contact her at tayer@yakimaherald.com. Yakima Herald Republic's Vanished webpage includes numerous articles written by Tammy, and you can also find Tammy's upcoming article about the unidentified woman, also called Parker Doe, soon. Again, she's been unidentified for 33 years, and she needs a name. Her family has been waiting for answers. I'm going to read actually a little bit from the Vanished page. Much work still needs to be done to protect Native women, and many questions must be answered. It's a start, supporters say, a start that encourages those who still wonder what happened to their loved ones and hope to save others. They are missing and murdered Native women and girls, mothers, grandmothers, daughters, and sisters, aunties, friends. They have names, they have stories, and they are no longer invisible. Again, we are an Indigenous-led podcast surviving under the duress of colonization and intergenerational trauma towards self-determination. I'm Emily Washings, and thank you to the War Cry co-hosts, Robin, Lucy, and Patsy. And thank you again to our guest, Tammy Ayer. For our credits, we have support from Native Women in Action. This is This episode is edited and produced by Robin Kibishi. Logo and shirts by John Olney Schellenberger with Native Anthro. Some shirts by Nicole Pibishi, and music by Lee Sikakwaktiwa. Again, you can stream our podcast at all available streaming platforms and YouTube. Let us leave us a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from.